I split the viewport and open the shader editor. I make a new material for the cube, making sure that I'm in material preview. I delete the principal BSDF and add an emission shader. This will allow me to use light as part of the material. I add a noise texture and a math node to add some distortion to the lighting effect. I connect the factor of the noise texture to the math node. I change the function of the math node to multiply and connect it to the strength of the emission shader. I change the emission shader color to a bright blue. I change the dimension of the noise texture to 4D. This means I have access to the W input, which is an additional texture coordinate. I change the scale of the noise texture to 10 and the value of the math node to 10. I select these three nodes and use Ctrl-J to add a frame. I right-click and rename the frame. I add a mix shader and a transparent BSDF shader. I also add a texture coordinate node and a separate XYZ node along with the color ramp. This set of nodes will allow me to add a gradient to the lighting. I connect the generated texture coordinate to the separate XYZ node. I connect the Z output of the separate XYZ node to the color ramp. I connect the color output of the color ramp to the factor of the mix shader. I connect the transparent BSDF to the top shader input of the mix shader. I connect the emission shader to the bottom shader input of the mix shader. Finally, I connect the mix shader to the material output. I reverse the color stops on the color ramp. I change the color of the transparent BSDF to a bright blue. I select these 5 nodes and use Ctrl-J to add a frame. I right-click and rename the frame. I add a new mix shader node and connect it to the material output. I connect the previous mix shader to the bottom input of the new mix shader. I also add an emission shader, color ramp, layer weight, and geometry node. This set of nodes will allow me to light up the faces and add depth. I connect the true normal output of the geometry node to the normal of the layer weight. This is the flat normal of the surface. I connect the facing output of the layer weight node to the color ramp. This weight is used for layering different shaders. I reverse the color stops of the color ramp. I move the white color stop to position 0.5 and the black color stop to position 0.75. I connect the color output of the color ramp to the factor of the emission shader. I connect the new emission shader to the top shader input of the mix shader. I select these 5 nodes and use Ctrl-J to add a frame. I right-click and rename the frame. I add a new mix shader node and connect the current mix shader to the bottom shader input. I connect the new mix shader to the material output. I add a color ramp and an emission shader. I also add a vector math node, a geometry node, and a bevel node. This set of nodes will highlight the edges of the model. I connect the bevel node to the top vector input of the vector math node. The bevel node will allow for rendering rounded corners. The vector math node will allow me to use the dot product math operation. I change the operation of the vector math node to dot product and connect it to the color ramp. I connect the true normal of the geometry node to the vector math node. I connect the color output of the color ramp to the factor of the mix shader. I move the black color stop of the color ramp to position 0.75. I connect the emission shader to the top vector input of the mix shader. To see the edges a bit easier, I increase the samples on the bevel node. I select these 6 nodes and use Ctrl-J to add a frame. I right-click and rename the frame. I add a new mix shader node and connect it to the material output node. I connect the previous mix shader node to the bottom shader input of the new mix shader node. I add a transparent BSDF and a wave texture. This combination of nodes will add scan lines to the object. I connect the factor of the wave texture to the factor of the new mix shader. I change the band's direction to Z. I change the scale to 20 and the distortion to 1. I connect the transparent BSDF to the top shader input of the mix shader. I change the color of the transparent BSDF to a dark gray. I select these 3 nodes and use Ctrl-J to add a frame. I right-click and rename the frame. I set up my camera view. For the glow effect, I switch to the compositing workspace. I activate Use Nodes. I add a Viewer node and reconnect the Render Layers node. I use F12 to view the scene. I tap the V key to fit the image into the viewport. Add a glare effect between the Render Layers node and the other nodes. I changed the fog type to fog glow. I also changed the mix to 0.5. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. If you enjoyed this video about making a hologram effect in Blender, you may enjoy this video. Have a good day.